Imagine for a second that your life suddenly goes completely off the rails, like a real crisis hits.
Oh, yeah, the kind that just strips away all your comfortable routine.
Exactly. The floor just completely drops out. So,
Yeah.
what is your ultimate fallback strategy? Are you the kind of person who, immediately rolls up their sleeves, taps into that aggressive, pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality, and just tries to sheer willpower your way out of the problem?
Right, the classic fix-it mode.
Yeah, exactly. Or do you instinctively retreat the other way, like leaning heavily on a rigid set of rules or systems or institutional structures to kind of keep everything orderly when the chaos starts creeping in?
It is, it's the classic divide in human psychology, really. When the pressure spikes, we naturally gravitate toward one of two safety nets. We either trust our own internal strength to save us, or we trust an external system to protect us.
Yeah.
We basically all default to one or the other.
And that deeply ingrained human instinct is exactly what we are dissecting today on our deep dive. We are looking at a fascinating breakdown by Chris Myers. It's a sermon delivered at Dwell City Church on Palm Sunday.
It's a great piece of source material.
It really is. And what is so compelling about it is how accurately this 2,000-year-old text from the Gospel of John, specifically chapter 18, how it diagnoses our modern coping mechanisms.
Right.
So the mission for our deep dive today is to unpack the profound claims this text makes about the total insufficiency of both of those fallback strategies. I mean, self-reliance shatters and rigid rule following just corrupts.
Yeah, it totally corrupts.
And the speaker contrasts both of these flawed human instincts with what he terms the sufficiency of Christ.
It is a really remarkable piece of analysis because it takes this historical narrative that, a lot of people think they already understand, and it completely strips it down to the psychological studs.
Literally down to the studs.
It asks you to look in the mirror and figure out what you are actually trusting in when the chips are down, using the very real, very flawed people in this story as your mirror.
Totally. And to really grasp the immense pressure these historical figures are under, we have to establish the timeline of this narrative, because the compression of events here is just staggering. We are picking up the story in John chapter 18, but the cascade of events spanning from chapter 13 to 18, they all happen within a suffocatingly tiny 6 to 12-hour window.
Which is crazy. When you read it, it feels like you should cover, weeks of political maneuvering and emotional turmoil.
Right.
But it is literally just one single night.
One incredibly dense, chaotic, exhausting night. I mean, within those few hours, you have the emotional weight of the Last Supper, Jesus' agonizing prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, the psychological blow of the betrayal by Jesus. Yeah, and then the sudden arrival of a massive armed mob to arrest Jesus, and now these midnight interrogations. Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the trap of self-reliance, or what the speaker identifies as the inadequacy of self.
Right. So the speaker frames this concept beautifully with a personal anecdote. He talks about growing up in a non-Christian home, which basically meant that whenever he faced a hurdle or a crisis, there was no, higher power to appeal to.
He was on his own.
Exactly. He had to figure out how to address it entirely on his own. And because of that environment, he developed a fiercely strong fix-it mentality. You know the type. If there's a problem, you just work harder, you strategize better, and you solve it.
Which, in almost every other area of life, we reward that, right? We love a problem solver. We buy books on life hacks and maximizing productivity.
Oh, we celebrate it. Absolutely. We build whole corporate cultures around it. But the speaker points out that this specific coping mechanism becomes a dangerous, blinding liability when you are dealing with the spiritual problem of salvation.
Wow. Okay. How so?
Because according to the theological framework of this text, salvation is the one problem you are fundamentally incapable of fixing yourself. It requires a perfection you just don't possess.
Right.
So if you try to apply that standard, I'll just work harder and solve it mentality to your spiritual standing, you end up trusting in your own resume rather than trusting in grace.
And the text gives us the ultimate tragic case study in the failure of that fix-it mentality in the character of Peter. So the narrative puts us in a courtyard. Jesus has been arrested and dragged to the house of a religious leader named Annas.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, Peter is outside, standing by a fire, trying to stay warm. And the irony of Peter being the one to completely break down here is just incredibly thick.
It really is. I mean, you have to understand Peter's baseline personality to fully appreciate the crash here.
Yeah.
Peter is the boldest, most boisterous, most strong-willed leader of the disciples.
The loud one.
Exactly. He is the guy who acts first and thinks second.
Wrong.
If anyone in that entire group was going to rely on pure, unadulterated willpower and physical courage, it was Peter.
I mean, just a few hours earlier at the Last Supper, Peter looked Jesus in the eye and swore, "I will die for you." And the wild thing is, he clearly meant it.
He totally did.
When the mob came to the garden to arrest Jesus, Peter didn't run. He pulled a sword against a cohort of trained soldiers and sliced off the ear of a man named Malchus. That is a guy who is fully prepared to go down swinging.
Yeah, but that is the physiological reality of human strength, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
In the garden, Peter is flooded with adrenaline. He is in full fight-or-flight mode, operating on peak physical instinct.
Just pure adrenaline.
Right. But now, cut to the courtyard, the adrenaline dump is over. The crash has fully set in. It is the middle of the night. He is exhausted. He is freezing cold, and he is deeply isolated in enemy territory.
That sounds miserable.
And it's in that depleted state that he is approached by the people around the fire. And the source points out a beautifully excruciating detail here. One of the individuals staring at Peter across the flames is a relative of Malchus.
Wait, the very man whose ear Peter just severed?
The exact same family, yes.
Oh man, you can almost feel the psychological walls caving in on him.
The panic would be absolute.
Mm-hmm.
So this relative asks what is essentially a loaded rhetorical question. He says, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?"
Which is terrifying.
It's not an honest inquiry at all.
Mm-hmm.
It is a direct accusation from someone with a blood vendetta. And in that split second, Peter's ironclad willpower, all those bold promises of dying for his friend, they just completely shatter. He denies even knowing Jesus.
And the source brings in a brilliant cross-reference from Matthew's account of this exact same night, which notes that Peter wasn't just like casually shaking his head and walking away.
No, it was intense.
As the pressure mounted, he began aggressively cursing and swearing, screaming, "I do not know this man." It is a total humiliating psychological collapse. And there is a profound literary contrast the speaker highlights here that really completely reframes how I view that scene.
Oh, the I am contrast.
Yes. When the mob of hundreds of armed soldiers came to arrest Jesus in the garden and asked for him, Jesus simply stepped forward and said, "I am." And the sheer authoritative power of that statement literally knocked the entire crowd backward to the ground.
It is framed as a raw, divine claim of identity. Just unshakable.
But then you look at Peter by the fire. He is asked by a servant girl if he is a disciple, and he cowers and whimpers, "I am not."
Wow.
Jesus takes out a small army simply by stating, "I am," and the strongest, boldest human in the story completely crumbles with, "I am not." It perfectly illustrates the total inadequacy of human strength when confronted with true spiritual weight.
Which leads right into the famous detail of the rooster crowing. Jesus had prophesied earlier that evening that before the rooster crowed, Peter would deny him 3 times. And the speaker makes a really humorous but deeply insightful point here. We often read this as some miraculous, magical rooster that was like summoned from the heavens to crow on divine command.
I loved that part. The speaker mentions his friend Jimmy, who raises chickens, and Jimmy can attest that roosters just crow every single morning. It's just their biological programming.
Right. They don't need a miracle to make noise.
Exactly. They are annoying, they are loud, and they are incredibly punctual.
The bird itself wasn't the miracle at all. The point was the mundane timing of it. Jesus was essentially telling Peter, you are so arrogant and confident in your willpower right now at 8 o'clock at night. But I'm telling you, by daybreak, by the time the rooster naturally does what a rooster does every single morning, your willpower will have entirely evaporated.
It's so humbling.
It really highlights how remarkably fragile human resolve is. It expires faster than the night.
To make this relatable to those of us who, aren't currently wielding swords in ancient gardens, the speaker introduces this concept of image management. When we rely on ourselves, we are constantly managing how others perceive us, constantly burning energy to maintain the illusion that we have it all together.
Oh, absolutely. It's exhausting.
And that spills over into how we interact with God. The speaker uses the metaphor of the vending machine God. But I want to take that a step further. It reminds me of people who treat their faith like a strict gym routine or like a diet they were just white-knuckling their way through.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
You think if you just log enough hours on the treadmill or check off enough boxes on a religious to-do list, you are owed a certain physique, or in this case, a certain blessing. Doesn't this show how our attempts at self-reliance often just turn faith into a transactional business where we're the ones holding the currency?
That is the exact danger of the vending machine mentality. If you are operating under that transactional approach, like reading your Bible 5 days a week, serving at a charity, and then expecting God to just dispense a promotion or a fixed marriage in return, you are still fundamentally relying on yourself.
You're trying to buy the outcome.
You are relying on your own ability to earn the currency, to buy the blessing. And when the machine doesn't dispense what you ordered, you become incredibly resentful because you feel like you bought and paid for it with your pristine behavior. It completely bypasses the concept of actual grace, because grace can't be earned or managed.
So if internal willpower is a total bust, if the strongest guy in the room breaks down crying because he can't manage his own image, where do we turn? We usually outsource our trust to the system. We look for rules. We look for institutions to tell us we are safe.
Which is our second fallback strategy.
Right. Which brings us to the second major theme, and the second group of people operating that night, the religious leaders.
Yes, the text shifts focus to show that trusting in rigid external systems is just as inadequate as trusting in the self. Jesus is currently being shuffled around in a deeply corrupt legal apparatus. And the text provides some fascinating geographical and historical mechanics here that show just how orchestrated this whole thing was.
Let's trace the steps of this midnight trial.
Okay, so Jesus is first taken to the house of Annas, the former high priest, who still held massive shadowy influence.
He was like the mob boss of the whole setup.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Annas gets nowhere with the interrogation, so he sends Jesus to Caiaphas, the current high priest. Now, historically and archaeologically, Annas and Caiaphas likely shared the exact same building compound, built around a central courtyard.
So this isn't some grand transfer across the city. He is essentially just being shoved a door down the hall to speedrun this conviction?
Precisely. It is a highly convenient change of venue to give the illusion of due process. Then, after Caiaphas is done with his portion of the trial, they move Jesus to the Praetorium, which is the headquarters of the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate.
Okay, and how far away is that?
Historically, this is roughly a 3/8 to half-mile journey from the high priest's compound. It is a short, brisk, 7-minute walk, and all of this logistical shuffling is happening in the dead of night, somewhere between 3 and 6 in the morning.
And it is at the doorstep of the Praetorium where the blinding, terrifying hypocrisy of the religious leaders is put on full display. They drag Jesus to Pilate's headquarters, but they refuse to actually step foot inside the building.
This is such a wild detail.
It is. Why? Because Pilate is a Gentile, and we need to explain the mechanics of this. According to their strict ceremonial laws, Gentile spaces were considered fundamentally contaminated. Merely brushing against a Roman doorframe or stepping over the threshold meant you absorbed that impurity, immediately disqualifying you from participating in the Passover meal later that day.
It is the ultimate historical example of missing the forest for the trees. I mean, they are meticulously following a minor ceremonial rule about where their sandals can step, perfectly protecting their pristine religious image.
Right.
While they are perfectly fine with using that exact same morning to orchestrate the murder of an innocent man. The system allows them to feel clean and righteous while actively committing a profound evil.
It makes me think of how a massive corporation handles, like, a massive ethical scandal. If the Human Resources Department can just strictly follow the compliance handbook, if they fill out the right forms in triplicate and follow the legal protocol, they feel totally absolved of any moral responsibility.
Even if the outcome ruins someone.
Exactly, even if it destroys someone's life. The rulebook just becomes a shield against having a conscience.
That is a perfect modern equivalent.
Yeah.
So the leaders call Pilate outside to them, forcing the Roman governor to accommodate their religious sensibilities. Pilate, acting as the judge, asks for a simple, standard legal accusation. What has this man done?
Standard procedure.
Right. And the leaders respond with the absolute epitome of institutional arrogance. They say, if this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you.
Which translates to, just trust us, don't ask questions, we're the institution. We investigated ourselves and found ourselves correct. But I have to push back on this because it seems completely absurd from a political standpoint. Why would these religious leaders even expect a Roman governor, a man representing the most powerful empire on earth, to just blindly execute someone without a formal written charge? Pilate isn't their employee.
You are right to spot the political tension there. And the source provides the geopolitical context for why they felt so emboldened to make that kind of demand. By this point in first century history, the high priesthood in Jerusalem wasn't just a religious role. It had become a highly political, deeply entrenched office.
Right.
They worked hand in hand with the Roman authorities to maintain peace, collect taxes, and suppress rebellions. In fact, Rome had already authorized the use of a Roman cohort, anywhere from 200 to 600 soldiers, to assist the temple guards in Jesus' arrest in the garden just hours
Oh,
earlier.
wow. That completely changes the dynamic. They already had Rome's muscle involved in the operation.
Exactly. They assumed that because of their immense political clout, and because Rome had already aided in the initial arrest, Pilate would just act as a rubber stamp to finish the job. They were so deeply embedded in a system of power that they believed the system would automatically execute their will without friction.
And the speaker takes this ancient political maneuvering and connects it directly to your life today. He uses this as a sharp critique of cultural Christianity. He specifically mentions having friends who pastor in the American South and how one of their biggest, most heartbreaking challenges is dealing with people who trust the system rather than actually possessing a living faith.
Yes, he warns against the danger of having the label of a believer without any of the actual character transformation to back it up.
Yeah.
People who just show up to church on Sunday believing they are entirely safe simply because they are part of the right organization, sitting in the right pew, or voting the right way. The speaker emphasizes that there is no actual fruit in their lives, no real love, joy, or sacrifice.
Just going through the motions.
They are trusting the institution of the church to save them, much like the religious leaders trusted their legal and political system to justify their actions.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because if human willpower utterly fails, like we saw with Peter crying by the fire,
Yep.
and if human legal systems are deeply corrupt and capable of profound hypocrisy, like we see with the religious leaders, who is actually pulling the strings in this chaotic narrative? The source text makes the audacious theological argument that it is actually Jesus himself who is orchestrating a divine plan through all this human failure.
This is where we see the theological concept of God's overarching plan, utilizing flawed human choices to arrive at a highly specific destination. Pilate is deeply frustrated by the arrogance of the religious leaders.
Right.
He tells them, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." He wants to wash his hands of the whole ordeal.
Right, he doesn't want to deal with it.
And the religious leaders respond with a very curious phrase. They say, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death."
Let me pause you there and play the skeptic for a second. Because I read that line and I immediately thought, wait a minute, wasn't stoning a very common Jewish punishment? Didn't the religious leaders have the established ability to execute people for breaking certain severe religious laws like blasphemy? We see people threatened with stoning, or actually stoned, in other parts of the historical texts.
That is a fantastic catch, and the source directly acknowledges this historical reality. Yes, they absolutely did have the authority and the historical precedent to execute people via stoning for certain severe religious infractions.
So why say it's not lawful?
When they told Pilate, "It is not lawful for us," they were playing politics. They were either leaning on a temporary Roman restriction, or they were simply lying and deflecting because they specifically wanted Rome to do the dirty work. They wanted the gruesome public spectacle of a Roman execution to completely discredit Jesus.
Ah, optics.
But the speaker makes a fascinating theological observation here. Their political deflection was actually the exact mechanism God used to fulfill a much older promise.
How does their political maneuvering fulfill a promise?
Because of the highly specific prophecies Jesus had made about the manner of his own death. Jesus had predicted multiple times that he wouldn't just be killed, but that he would be lifted up. He specifically referenced an ancient story from the Torah, saying that just as Moses lifted up the bronze serpent in the wilderness on a pole to heal the people, so must the Son of Man be lifted up.
I see the mechanics of it now. Stoning someone to death does not lift them up. You push them down into a pit or off a ledge and hurl rocks down at them.
Precisely. But Roman crucifixion does lift a person up. The Romans were the ones who utilized crucifixion as a tool of state terror. If the Jewish leaders had handled it internally and stoned Jesus in an alleyway, that specific overarching prophecy would have failed.
That is incredible to think about. So the narrative is claiming that God is sovereignly using the blinding hypocrisy of the Jewish leaders, their political desire to pass the buck, and the sheer geopolitical presence of Pilate to engineer the exact method of execution required. And the text even points out the geographic improbability of Pilate even being there to authorize it.
Right. Pilate normally resided in his palatial estate in Caesarea Maritima, way over on the coast. He hated being in Jerusalem.
But he was there.
But he happened to be in the city because it was the Passover holiday, and he was required to be there with a heavy troop presence to ensure the massive crowds didn't start a riot.
So you have all these massive global political moving parts, a Roman governor traveling days to be in the city, religious leaders refusing to use their own established execution methods because of optical politics, and it is all aligning to ensure this one specific historical outcome.
What's fascinating here is how the speaker ties all these threads into the overarching theological conclusion of the source. The foundational theological framework of this text states that the penalty for human brokenness, for sin, required a perfect substitute and the shedding of blood.
Right.
The speaker argues that neither human strength, like Peter's aggressive willpower, nor strict adherence to institutional laws, like the religious leader's obsession with being ceremonially clean, could ever achieve that salvation. The whole system was bankrupt. It required the perfect, sinless life of Jesus voluntarily stepping into this chaotic, corrupt machinery to go to the cross.
It is a complete paradigm shift for you as a listener. It takes the camera, which has been zoomed in on these frantic, panicked people, and pulls it way, way back to show the massive architecture of the narrative. So let's pull all of this together and summarize the 3 core takeaways we've unpacked from this text today. First, our natural human tendency to rely on our own willpower to white-knuckle our way through a crisis is deeply flawed. It will eventually shatter under pressure, just like the strongest disciple broke down crying by a fire.
Second, our reliance on external systems, rigid rules, and institutional safety nets can actually blind us to our own profound moral failures. We can become so hyper-focused on keeping our hands clean in the eyes of the corporate or religious system we belong to that we become capable of excusing or even participating in real evil.
And third, the ultimate conclusion of the source text is that true rescue cannot be found by looking inward at the self or outward at the law. It relies solely on the sufficiency of Jesus orchestrating a plan of grace that humans couldn't possibly engineer on their own.
It demands a total surrender of our favorite coping mechanisms. You have to let go of your bootstraps and your rule books.
So what does this all mean? How does this actually change the way we process our own inevitable failures? Well, I want to leave you with a final lingering thought, something that builds on the text we discussed today, but pushes the implications a bit further. The source briefly mentions a fascinating parallel. There were actually 2 disciples who failed spectacularly that night. Judas betrayed Jesus, and Peter denied him. Both of their self-reliance strategies failed.
Right, they both hit rock bottom.
But their outcomes were entirely different. The text notes that after Peter's willpower collapsed, he wept bitterly. And unlike Judas, whose failure consumed him, Peter didn't let his worst moment be the end of his story. Later on, after the resurrection, Jesus tracks Peter down and completely restores him, asking him 3 times, "Do you love me?"
It is a stunning piece of symmetry. 3 cowardly denials by a fire, met with 3 intentional restorations by a fire.
So here is the question for you to ponder as you go about your week. When your own self-reliance inevitably shatters when your willpower runs out, or the system you trusted lets you down, what determines whether that failure destroys you or becomes the exact moment you finally let go and accept grace?
That's the real question.
How do you handle the terrifying moment your carefully crafted image management completely falls apart? Does it break you permanently, or does it finally set you free from the burden of trying to save yourself?
That is the ultimate test of what you are truly trusting in when the floor drops out.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the systems you trust, keep examining the strength you rely on, and we will see you next time.